Achtung, welcome. It's We Have Ways of Making You Talk Thursday special edition, and we're delighted to be joined again by Guy Walters, but we're not going to talk about Nazis this time, or are we?
Oh, I'm sure there's
they might slip in. They might slip in.
They might pop up. Guy, what are you doing with your lockdown extra time at home? Staring at four walls. I mean, you know,
I'm doing things like this. No, I'm actually planning a couple more books at the moment. So at the time of speaking, it's too early to say whether they're in the bag, but that's partly thanks to the excellent Holland J that those might come about. So I'm very grateful to him. And I'm also teaching my son to drive. So that is it.
Oh Christ!
So it's like being a frontline soldier. Every day you go to bed alive is a good day. You know, it's
my dad. There's the village where my parents live. There's an old airfield at the end of the road, basically. That was a Wellington training station, I think. And he took me up on it. He used to have this old Land Rover, proper old Land Rover double D clutch thing. And he took me up on the airfield and just said, "All right, then off you go." He just assumed I knew you had to put the clutch in and then take it out and all that sort of thing. We kangaroo started around this, great big stretch of runway, defunct runway, and then he drove me home, and that's the only driving lesson he ever gave me. And then my poor mother had to take over.
I did loads with my son. I quite enjoyed it, actually. I found I was a surprisingly calm co-driver. It was really all right. We kind of bonded. It was great fun.
Oh, that's nice.
No, I'm enjoying it a lot, and it's not as good. Just as you're saying, Al, it's not a natural thing, changing gears and doing clutches. If you've never driven a car, why would you know how to do that? It's insane.
Why would you even? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not something anyone explains to you while they're driving.
Yeah.
Anyway,
you might want to put on the brakes rather suddenly.
Yeah.
Right now, so last time we spoke to you, we talked about hunting evil or not. But the thing I think that you really want to talk about, and this is actually a thing that has been bugging me for a really long time and sort of has fed into the stand-up I do, actually, is the legacy of the Second World War in British culture, in UK political culture, popular culture, and not just all the chaps in red shirts who come to red trousers who come to Chalk Valley History Festival who want to perv on the Panzers and the Shermans or whatever that James is and listen and enjoy the roar of Spitfires. There is something really interesting and deep and textured, isn't there?
Yeah.
The war even just calling it the war.
It's become our national mythology, because we don't have a national mythology. The Greeks and Romans do. The old Norsemen had their Thor and Odin, and we've never had a sort of mythology in that way, and it's become it. It's become it certainly for a certain part of the population, shall we say, because you now have these. What do mythologies need? They need a host of characters, goodies and baddies, and they also need some truly epic events and battles. And what is the Second World War? It has all that in spades.
And it offers it you. It offers it you, even if you look at the British Empire and how ghastly the British Empire was, and the crimes of empire. The Second World War offers you an out from that, doesn't it?
It's a morally very comfortable war.
Last good, and you could say it's the only, and if you're of that tilt, even if you can say, at last we did something right. At last we did a good thing. It's the only good thing we've ever done. Blah blah blah. So it offers people of all persuasions this mythic texture. Yeah,
absolutely. Because I think conflicts, as you say, empire is problematic. Conflicts after the war are problematic. Suez, Iraq, Falklands is problematic for some, and so therefore, you look at the Second World War, and as you say, it's a morally very comfortable war. If you fought on the Allied side in the Second World War, you can go to bed at night thinking you fought on the right side. Are we the goodies? To invert the Mitchell Webb sketch, yes, we are the goodies. And it's very, very easy. But I think that also it's this idea that you have the way that we behaved in the war, or we felt that we behaved in the war, and the national identity derived from our wartime experience that I've argued in talks feeds straight into from Blitz spirit to Brexit spirit. And then, of course, recently with the coronavirus, what's the first thing that happens is that our experience of corona is instantly compared to the wartime experience. And rightly or wrongly, in some ways it's perfectly correct in terms of innovation, R&D, things happening very quickly. Yes.
Well, and it's totality.
And it's,
I mean, I suppose the other reason we compare it to the Second World War is the only other history people know popular is Henry VIII.
Right.
So it's not like you can compare the coronavirus to Anne Boleyn.
No, you can't.
It's a lot like Thomas Cromwell, because basically, if you've come through and history obviously is a massive hot potato politically, and the coalition government made it so. Michael Gove really made it so, and there was a lot of pushback about the idea of making history more sort of. There's arguments about it being pub quizzing and all that sort of thing. But the history people in this country know the two things they definitely know about. Henry VIII, and the Second World War. So I mean, it's little wonder that we've ended up comparing.
And I think that the propaganda put about by the war for good reasons about British exceptionalism. We're on our own. Only we can stand against it because I know that Jim has an absolute perfectly good argument that we weren't so technically on our own, but in terms of this idea of the fact that of course we had a huge empire, but the fact is we felt on our own, and the propaganda said we're going to have to do this on our own, and that of course then feeds in.
But even that's really interesting, because I saw David Edgerton gave a lecture last year at my old college about exactly that, the myth of alone, and so he's done a Google search on newspaper editorials from 1940, and they're all about and all the propaganda, and there's that famous cartoon, All Right,
by
Alone,
Lowe,
right. Yeah, but all of the editorial at the time is, we with our empire will withstand this. That even at that point, which we now look at as the alone moment, they weren't saying that at the time. And he's combed through it all. And I went to this lecture. It's absolutely fascinating. And what happened during the war itself is that the Tories obviously they think, right, well, we're going to have to find a conservative argument for why we've done so well in the war. And Labour, being anti-imperial, have to create this idea of the exceptionalism of the British character, which means the working class need to be rewarded. The Tories, it's because we're British that we're special and we're world beating. That's how we've done this. And so by 1945, their two stories have transmuted into basically national, arguably nationalist expression of how the war's been dealt with, that then feeds into 50s accounts,
but
60s
Al,
historiography. So you've got Angus Calder in the 60s, People's War, is writing an exceptionalist account of the British. But that's also and what really happened. It's really interesting.
But that also comes out at the time of Corelli Barnett and also A.J.P. Taylor and kind of rubbishing it, sort of saying that the British economy was absolutely rubbish in the Second World War, that we were all a bit shit.
Yeah.
And what I think is really interesting is you see these changes. So in the late 1940s and late 1950s, we're broadly going, do you know what, we did a damn good job. And so you have 633 Squadron and the Dam Busters and stuff that sort of celebrating British brilliance. Then you get the 60s, and you get the start of the declinist movement, and that's also tying in with end of empire, decline of Britain as a great power, 3-day weeks, all the rest of it.
And fear of a third world war as well.
Fear of the third world war and the emergence of USSR and the United States as the two superpowers, and sort of Britain squeezed in the middle. So that kind of earlier kind of sort of dominance in global affairs has been crushed. And you can't sort of quite believe that Britain could have ever been this sort of dominant position that had the world's largest navy, the world's largest trading empire, etc., etc., etc. And so there's this kind of sort of realignment, and at the same time you're getting Dad's Army and It Ain't Half Hot Mum, and this idea of sort of ridiculing the kind of sort of British war effort and sort of celebrating British amateurism and backs to the wall and sort of general kind of crapness and all the rest of it, which is all very funny and is all part of our kind of sort of self-deprecating kind of approach to humour, but it feeds into this idea that we're all just sort of hanging off the shirt tails of the Americans, all a bit rubbish, and just sort of somehow managed to hang on.
but also, if I wanted to tell us a national foundation myth, which is where we started here, that the birth of the modern Britain, that, you know, of course, has the welfare state and the NHS as its start, as its fruit, as it were. This myth gives birth to this modern Britain that we live in. I'd rather tell a story about how we were on our own, we were plucky, we scraped through by the skin of it. It's a better story.
Yeah,
that is a better myth than we had the biggest empire in the world, a military machine that had been warmed up and tuned only 20 years previously, a long tradition of fighting our enemies at arm's length because of our preponderant naval strength, blah blah blah. You know, the story that you tell, James, in your history.
The story of the underdog is more sexy.
I'd much rather be the plucky underdog who scraped through the end rather than the great big grinding war machine, you know. We need to take a short break now. I'll see you in a tick. Imagine, it's September 1944. Jim Gavin is nervously clambering up the Grosbeak Heights. He's sure he's forgotten something, but what can it be? The sky begins to darken and he opens a bottle of beer. A fine, local Dutch beer. Ah, that tastes good. God damn it, he shouts, his brain suddenly alive. We've forgotten to take the bridge. Men, 30 Corps will be here any moment. Let's go take that bridge. As soon as I finish this lovely beer. Now, Beer 52 didn't exist in 1944, but if it did, well, old Jim Gavin might have remembered his primary job just that little bit quicker. Beer 52 source the best craft ales from around the world and deliver them to your door. Each month they send you 8 beers, and if you sign up now, you get the first case of 8 craft beers for a £5. That's right, a £5. Just go to beer52.com/talk to get your first 8 beers for £5. There's no obligation, you can cancel any time. That's beer52.com/talk. Hey Jim, get a shift on, will you? We haven't got all day.
So, as well as the right creating this sort of idea of this political construct of sort of nationalism, you've also got the left also using the war for its own ends as well. And so they call it the People's War. And you can see there's a whole subsection of the BBC website that was assembled, about a decade ago, which was called the People's War. And that's a left-wing idea. It's a socialistic enterprise.
Well, this is Angus Calder, isn't it?
Yeah,
whose father was involved in the propaganda effort in the war to try and get people to mobilise, and so he sort of inherits that idea. I mean, that's really interesting in itself, because during the Brexit shenanigans, there was a lot of mockery of, say, Mark Francois going on about, well, we didn't. My dad didn't fight the Nazis on the beaches of Normandy.
And Whittaker,
one of those. But the thing is, all right. So it is ridiculous when people crap on about the war and how they won it, even though it was their grandpa. But it's also kind of absurd for someone to go, well, we invented the health service in 1947. It's the
the beverage report was commissioned before the war.
Well, I know exactly, but there's only 3 years separating those.
Yeah.
There's only 3 years separating those events. If one's absurd to claim credit for you doing it, then why is the other one politically sound to claim credit for, if you see what I mean? And it's very interesting how sticky the People's War idea is, whereas the nationalist one is kind of the one that I'm sure we all find funny. I mean, when Mark Francois does do his thing, when he goes on about his dad on D-Day, you think, oh, whatever, mate, your name's Francois, and everyone starts laughing at the fact he has a French name, and so on, and all this sort of stuff. Whereas when the left say, well, we create the NHS, it's a stickier idea, and one that
it's cuddlier, isn't it? But I also think,
well, exactly, and a lot of this does come down to because we're talking about mythic things. It's myths are there to give you comfort and to help you to figure out, define who you are, and make decisions now.
But in terms of giving comfort, the right use it to give comfort, because do you remember when the Luxembourg Prime Minister empty podium Boris Johnson during the Brexit thing, and Sir Ian Duncan Smith turned round and said, we didn't fight the war for the Luxembourg Prime Minister to sort of humiliate our Prime Minister like this. And that feeds back to this idea. This idea that no, we didn't.
It was our obligation to Poland.
Is that we had that somehow the rest of Europe is still in our debt, and of course that infects the way we talk to the rest of the world. If you feel that even Luxembourg, France, you name it, they actually owe us something. And they've always got to behave in a certain way because we supposedly stood alone for a few months in 1940. I mean, it's just nonsense.
But the other thing is that we've become sort of increasingly mawkish about it as well. So, you know, the first big commemoration of the end of the war, VE Day, after 1945 was 1995 because it was the 50th, and there was this sense that in the 50s and 60s, you know, all those war veterans, they're just getting on with their lives and they're kind of sort of putting it behind them, and they're sort of getting married and having jobs and having kids, and the kids are kind of, you know, the Beatles are coming to the fore, and there was, you know, it's that brilliant scene in A Hard Day's Night where the stuffy bowler-hatted man in the carriage says to the Beatles, I didn't fight the war for you type, or I fought the war for you types. And John Lennon goes, I bet you wish you hadn't. And you know, there's that kind of sort of rebellion against it. And then suddenly in 1995, we all kind of sort of realised, oh my God, you know, these veterans, they're getting to their 70s now. You know, they're not going to be with us forever. And it's the 50th, so it's a big obvious one to celebrate. And ever since then, we've absolutely gone to town because we realise that these guys, this generation is slipping away, and you know, that's the whole point about the 70th and the 75th.
There is this. I mean, we've discussed before about memorialisation fatigue, and it's interesting you mentioned the Battle of Britain, because when I was preparing my talk on this, I looked at cabinet notes from the Macmillan's cabinet when they're trying to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, and the cabinet turns round and says it's not appropriate to commemorate the Battle of Britain. If there's going to be a commemoration, there can be a hall of residence at Sussex University named after the Battle of Britain, and a roundabout in Lincolnshire.
And the RAF are livid, aren't they? Because they're rolling up RAF schools. That's when you get that guy flies the Hunter under Tower Bridge to protest that the RAF's fighter strength is being wound down.
Yes.
And they're going, we saved the country 20 years ago. What's wrong with you? You know, why are you doing this to us? And obviously, and you've got that whole thing where they're developing Blue Streak and all this Cold War kit to replace
the end of the Fairy Delta 2.
Okay, listen to this. I've got Harold Macmillan, April 11th, 1960. Harold Macmillan to the Secretary of State of Air. I suggest to go on holding this big Battle of Britain exhibition on Horse Guards Parade. Holding it year after year will become increasingly anachronistic. The 20th anniversary seems as good a time to call a halt as any.
Well, right, it's a guardsman.
So yeah, right. But it's this idea that also, but amongst that cabinet, and it wasn't. And I take your point about the RAF and them turf war about the RAF with other services, but also there was a general feeling, not just with the Battle of Britain, not just the RAF, that the war was not something you commemorate in the way that we now commemorate it. And so when I looked at Times reports of 1954 D-Day celebrations, it's about 2 inches on page 4,000, and a couple of bewildered French people saying, and a couple of bewildered, you know, people walking around. Really, very little happens. And of course, as it goes on and on, I mean, my argument is that I think there's become an over-memorialisation, people getting fatigued with it, and the sentimentality of it starts getting excessive.
But here's a comparable a point of comparison I'd like to offer. In the Soviet Union in the 70s, they realised that basically, the Brezhnev government thought, right, okay, we can't deliver this utopian communist state that we've promised everyone. So what they did was began a propaganda effort, and this is where to say to people, communism is worthwhile because we defeated the Nazis in the Great Patriotic War, and that is where then the war becomes central to the story of the Soviet state. And that Nazism, the only way you could possibly defeat Nazism was through communism. Not communism is now going to deliver you a beautiful future, but look at the past it won for you, and look at that explains how we live now. And I think part of what's happening here is our politics has basically, is essentially. They've run out of things to argue about, which is how you end up with a thing like Brexit. They've run out of things to actually do. So you end up having to justify the way things are by leaning on your myth and leaning on your foundation myth. And I think that's why the war permeates things so much more, is because after all, those old battles of left and right kind of got run out of town in the last 25 years. Consensus politics ends, then there's a new post-Thatcherite consensus that you've had a wobble. The Labour tried to change tack on in the last 5-10 years, but don't seem to have succeeded in doing so. So everyone ends up leaning back on the Second World War, and it's not at the level like it is in Soviet Russia and then post-Soviet Russia, where it's the Great Patriotic War, and it's a thing people still go on about and still how they still define themselves, but we still go on about it, and we do still define ourselves with it. And I think it's a really interesting point in comparison, because it's the countries that won the Second World War where this is happening. Whereas in Germany, they've used it as an opportunity to take stock about questions of morality and the limits of the state, and losing is the thing that's been the thing that's. I mean, we need to get a German on to talk about that, or several generations of Germans to talk about that, because the way they've digested
you always learn more about yourself if you've lost a fight than if you've won a fight.
Well, exactly, and maybe what you don't. Anyway, I mean, I just think this is so endlessly fascinating, and we all grew up on Action Man, Airfix, The Great Escape, the khaki glamour of the 70s, which is interesting that the previous decade, they're saying, the politicians go, we can't go on commemorating this, and then we bloody well did anyway, and there was nothing anyone could do about it.
Yeah.
I mean,
but I do think what's interesting is as we've got on to the kind of sort of the 50th, the 60th, the 70th, the 75th, and the 80th, and we're now approaching 80th anniversaries, it is really about the veterans now. It's about, it is about the fact that this is a generation an ordinary generation that was asked to do extraordinary things. And I think the thing about the Second World War is it affected every man, woman and child of all the major competent nations in a way that no other conflict has. So there is that kind of sort of deep resonance because of that. The problem, of course, is that we venerate all these people quite rightly, and yet, I mean, there's a brilliant book by Keith Lowe called "The Fear and the Freedom," and analysing it, and he's saying, not everyone was a hero. I mean, not everyone.
Well, of course.
And it is sort of slightly problematic. We have become sentimental. We have become slightly mawkish about this.
Well, I mean, the Battle of Britain fighter pilots in the 50s, very few of them went to the annual Battle of Britain service at St Paul's or Westminster, wherever it was held. And in fact, and again, just looking at some of these documents from Kew I looked at a few months back, and saying, literally, so these chaps were probably, in their 30s? So they were young, in their 40s, and they never turned up. They had no interest in going, for whatever reasons, private reasons. It was too painful, or they didn't think they should be sort of valorised in that way. And then when they got as old as 50, it was some of the powers that be didn't want all these old men in their 50s walking around. It kind of looked bad. So I mean, so you're right, Jim. I mean, it should be about the veterans. If it's not about the veterans, and then if it's just sort of empty pageantry, then for my money, it's a waste of time.
But that sounds quite normal to me. That's like I've only just started thinking about going back to my old university college from when I was 19, 21. I've never been interested. My callow youth, and I know that their callow youths were spent quite differently and not in a callow way. But you know what I mean. That when you're 30, you don't think, wasn't it brilliant when I was a lad? Even and also, I mean, I remember when I came to your Great Escape lecture at the RAF Club, the point you made about a lot of the people in those camps of airmen, prisoners of war, is they'd been in plane crashes, these people. They'd gone through really horrifying things. So probably they weren't that interested in revisiting a lot of it. Because after all, everything you read about being a Battle of Britain fighter pilot is absolutely terrifying. So you add those two things together, of course they didn't go.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is interesting what you're saying. And like you, Al, I've suddenly found myself going on these somewhat nostalgic trips and actually refriending people from my sort of late teens and university times, which has actually been great. But I think you're right, and I'm approaching 50, and I suspect that some of these chaps at that age probably then did start getting into it again. So when would your Battle of Britain fighter pilot been born? 1920? So in 1970, perhaps, then he might have started, by your metric, he might have started.
But it's incredibly typical that you after the war, you come back, you get demobbed, you get into civvy life, you settle down, you get married, you have kids, you're focusing on your career, bringing up your children, all the rest of it. And it's not until, for a lot of people, it's actually even a little bit later than that. It's more like sort of mid-60s, early 70s. You've suddenly got a bit of time on your hands, and you've got that time to analyse what happened to you, think about it, and suddenly a letter comes through the post saying, would you be interested in joining this sort of, ship's association of HMS Kelly, and you think, well, it would be quite fun to go and see some of those guys, in exactly the same way that you think, it would be quite fun to go back and see some of my old university mates and visit my old haunts. And so that's why you get this sort of sudden kind of flurry of veterans associations suddenly springing up in the kind of 1980s and 1990s. And it is why 1995, the VE Day celebration of 1995, in May 1995, was such a massive deal. Because it was the big one. It was 50, and it was kind of, everyone who'd fought in the Second World War was now retired. They've got time to devote to this. Mobilised and think about it. And Hyde Park was just absolutely enormous. There was a veterans centre. There was a tent where you could go in and every squadron, every battalion was listed in there, and you could go and see who was there and hook up with your old mates and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was the most amazing thing. And that's what... And at the same time, you then think, then you start talking about it. So by this point, you've got grandkids, and the grandkids are more interested than the children were at their comparable age, because there's that much distance. And they go, tell us the stories. You go, you don't want to know about all that nonsense. And they go, yeah, we do. And you sort of think, well, actually, I've got time now. I might jot down my memories, and I'll do it for my family. And then you think, actually, I'm rather good at this. I'll get it published. And, you trot off to Pen and Sword or William Kimber, and off you go. And that's why that's how it develops. But we're now at the absolute tail end of that, because, of course, these guys are all in their kind of mid 90s at the youngest.
So here's the question, and when will the Second World War end? Is it like Zhou Enlai and the French Revolution? It's too soon to say, because if the French Revolution is France's national founding myth, then 1940 stood alone is arguably maybe an English, maybe a British foundation myth in the way that 1940, in the way that 1945. British and Imperial forces victorious isn't, if you see what I mean. When is the war? When is the Second World War going to end? Because it's our generation who are most into it. I expect my kids' generation aren't. I mean, they have to do GCSE. Nazis,
my hunch is. I mean, I gave a talk about this topic to my son's school, and to the sixth form. And I then asked them at the end of the talk, how much do you guys think about the war? How much do you read about the war? How much do you watch Second World War films? Yeah. And they just shrugged their shoulders. It really isn't as sort of important for that generation, I suspect, as it is for us. I mean, you've got to remember... No,
I don't think it was. I don't think it was when I mean, I couldn't give a toss about the Second World War when I was 18 or 17. Not a fig.
Just
wasn't interested. And I think the thing, I think the whole thing about history is it's the one subject you study at school that you can then revisit in later life. And I think it's not until you get to your sort of late 20s, 30s, 40s that you start to kind of wanting to see that bigger picture, and that you actually look beyond kind of, girlfriend's next party, whether you're going to get a 50 in the next cricket match or score a hat-trick in the football match. Because your childhood horizons are so narrow, and they just get broader as you get older, inevitably. And I think what is really interesting is that the kind of hardcore readership of Anthony Beevor's books and Max Hastings' books has been generally a kind of older one. What's really interesting about this podcast is the vast majority of people are under 50 that watch it, and actually a majority are under 44. And that to me suggests that there's a kind of that it's going to keep running and running.
They may have been brainwashed like me by their father, though. It may be that they have no control over themselves.
So for us, the war is never over.
Yeah, but I don't think so. It's at some point, but I think well, it'll change again. It'll change in what people really think about it. I mean, obviously we have talked about this forever in this country. We the three of us could talk about this forever. Is the simple truth. But I think. Gosh. Anyway, well, thanks very much, Guy.
It's just so endlessly fascinating. It's so big. It's such a vast subject. There's so much human drama. There's so much nuance to it. There's so much tech. It's just, you can make models about it. You can see Spitfires flying. You can go to Sicily and see battle damage in an old bunker. You can go to, you can go to the Zelo Heights and see trenches. You can flip it out. You can go to Manipur State and see British foxholes and trenches and mortar pits from the Battle of Imphal. What's not to like? I mean, it's amazing.
Well, actually, we've got this far and we haven't asked you what your favourite mark of Spitfire is, Guy. I feel like we've...
I just don't know anything about Spitfires. I don't know anything about them. I don't know anything. Probably the nice one.
All right. Okay. Well, I think
the Spitfire one.
I think it's time to say goodbye, Guy. Honestly. Well, thanks very much for talking to us, and we'd love you to come back and talk about The Great Escape again or with us at some point. That'd be really fantastic.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Will. Cheerio, everyone.
Cheers.